What a privilege it is to be here. I'm so honored by the invitation. How many of you have heard the big news in the philosophical world of Sir Anthony Flew's change of heart? For probably the last 30 years, the world's foremost atheist has been a British philosopher named Anthony Flew. He's now 81 years old. He made it a habit of debating Christians on the existence of God. He was a militant atheist. Well, this year he stunned the philosophical world by announcing that he had changed his mind. All his friends are now very angry at him. But he has concluded and has had the guts to say that God is the only good explanation for the origin of life and the complexity of nature. He was convinced ultimately by the argument from design, intelligent design. Careful to point out yet that he's not a Christian, but he does believe in a creative God. Well, this has rocked the world, and just last weekend, the New York Times did a series of articles on intelligent design and how schools in this country are once again starting to talk about the possibility of God. How many people are getting angry as a result? In fact, Sunday's article quoted a fellow named Dr. Douglas H. Irwin, a paleobiologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who's just absolutely furious about all this God talk. Here's his quote. He says, "One of the rules of science is no miracles allowed. That's a fundamental presumption of what we do." At least he's admitting that he begins with an assumption. What he's articulating is not science, but a faith, a religion. Some have called secular humanism, but he's decided that the way he looks at the world, God cannot exist. Now, Dr. Irwin hasn't studied history with Dr. Grant. He's ignorant of the fact that science as we know it arose from Christendom. He doesn't know that he has his job and he has his education. He's allowed to ask questions because he stands on the shoulders of giants, and there were men of faith who believed that all truth is God's truth and that it's okay to ask questions. You can ask any question you want. And so he now is living in a world in which there's at least one question you can't ask, because there's at least one answer that's unacceptable. He's now in a minority. The New York Times was stunned when they did their poll of scientists. It turns out that a majority of scientists believe in God. They're now starting to talk about it. Terrifying thing. I didn't hear about that when I was growing up. I grew up in public school, and now this whole thing, this talking about God as creator, it's coming into high school curriculums in some states. Kansas has said that teachers should talk about the evolution controversy, if nothing else, just to alert students that this is a theory that's controversial, that not even all scientists believe that evolution accounts for the origin of life. Schools I went to, they didn't tell me that there was a controversy. I thought it was us against the scientists. And as far as science was concerned, it was all settled. There's no God. It's not the case at all. First Christian school I went to was actually seminary. I went to Princeton Seminary. And you think FCS's work? Holy smokes. Imagine a whole faculty of Dr. Grants. And they all think they're the only teacher you have. 1,200 pages of reading a week on average. 3 papers a week on average. 2-hour lectures. When I graduated, they gave me this very impressive diploma that said, I am a Master of Divinity. Do you know that spiritually those were the 3 worst years of my life? I was so destroyed by seminary that I couldn't bring myself to accept a pastorate when I graduated because I wasn't even sure I was a Christian. I took a job as a janitor for a year and a half. Here's the thing, for me in seminary, God became a subject. For 2 of those years, I was actually a pastor of a church out in the country, a student pastor. I went and preached every week, I doubled the size of the church in 2 years. Started with 8 people and ended with 16. And every Sunday morning, I led them in prayer. And that was the only time I ever prayed. I opened my Bible and taught them something that I had found the night before, which was really the only time I ever looked in the Bible for something other than the answers to a test. And Christian school almost killed me. That's the strange thing about Christian school. It is so wonderful to be in an atmosphere where we can ask any question, where God's allowed in the room. And we can ask why historians address the subjects they do and ignore the ones they do. It's great to be in a place where we can say that history is his story. But there's this downside to it. It's always possible in a Christian school for God to become a subject. Sometimes I'm tempted to think that the hardest place to be a Christian is a Christian school. 10 years after I graduated from seminary, I was offered the job of running a Christian school. 450 students, K through 12, 50 faculty and staff. And I took the job. The 2 worst years of my life. I was horrible at it. I was just terrible at it. I thought that because I loved Christ, I loved kids, and I loved school, I would be good at running a Christian school. It turns out if you're going to run a school, you have to be organized. There have to be rules that you have to follow. There need to be schedules. You got to make unpopular decisions sometimes. You have to do unpleasant things. And I don't do unpleasant things very well. I like to have fun. So the kids loved me. But by the end of the first year, the teachers weren't talking to me anymore. And I created so much chaos at the school that, the fun quotient went up and the education quotient went down. And by the end of the second year, I packed it in. I found somebody to take my place, and I bailed. And then, you know what? I stopped going to church because I'd been so bad at Christian school. I somehow thought that because I'd failed in Christian school, I'd failed in Christianity, I'd failed God. I stopped going to church for a couple years. Show up occasionally when I had to, but I was checked out emotionally. I was gone. So I've had 2 experiences with Christian school, and both of them for me were a little rough. And I think it's because of just some fundamental misunderstandings. Have you ever wondered about Jesus' education? The Bible sees fit not to give us a lot of detail about Jesus' life, other than the details of his birth, one story from when he was 12 years old, and then we see him at 30. But we do know an awful lot about what school was like in Galilee in the first century. The Jews had returned from their exile in Babylon with something new added to their culture. Became known as the synagogue. They came back, and really, probably for the first time, in every town and village, they built this separate building that was just a gathering place and a place for education. And the elders of the town typically would hire somebody to be the teacher of the children. So when boys, and scholarly opinion is divided on this, but it seems quite likely that girls too, around the age of 5 years old, would start going to synagogue school. They'd go and they'd meet with the rabbi, and their education would begin. It consisted largely of the memorization of the Torah, and by the time a kid was 12 years old, he pretty much knew the entire Torah by heart. And also some reading and writing. But the education system in those days was highly competitive. Age 12, 13, there, a boy becomes a man. Girls kind of drop out of the picture. By age 15, most girls are married. By age 15, actually after age 12, boys are learning not just the Torah, but they're learning how to interpret the Torah. And they're working on impressing their rabbi. Because here's the deal. If you're going to go on to, let's call it college in those days, if you're going to go to advanced study, you have to impress the rabbi.